Hi, my name is Anthony Sovak, and I'm writing faculty here at Pima Community College. We're joined today by local poet and publisher Charles Alexander. Charles, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me. You're a most hospitable host.
Your most recent book, Some Sentences Look for Some Periods, recently took you to Portland, Oregon.
Yes, I was in Portland in an event actually that wasn't only about that book, but featured 9 poets that I have been involved with in publishing and in dialogue with over years, and some in one case over 30 years. And so there was actually a month-long exhibit, and then just this past weekend there was a reading featuring all of those poets, including myself in this book, and a gallery talk about the works in the exhibit. So it was a kind of a celebration and a wonderful time, and I came back thinking, where's my beautiful rain?
Yeah, in many ways it's our sister city, isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, I do know a lot of connections there, and people there that love to come here and people here that go there. I don't know how that happened.
So long before you published your first poem, were you convinced that you would be doing national book tours with a cadre of other poets?
Long before I published my first poem, no. I don't think long before I published my first poem, I knew I would be writing poems. And I think I knew pretty early on I would be writing poems that mattered to a number of people. But where that would take me in terms of the life in and around the poems, I was not at all sure. And I think if one shoots for the accoutrements of the life around poetry rather than focusing on the work to be done with words, you could get lost pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And about your writing process, when you wrote your first poem, can you tell us a little bit about this? And specifically, how did you know it was a poem? And I know that may sound like a silly question, but I'm thinking of, I hope I remember it right, it's Northrop Frye. He was teaching a class on medieval religion, and he wrote a list, and then his poetry students came in afterwards, and he hadn't had time to wipe it off the blackboard, and they came in and read it as a poem. And so it was a list, but now it's a poem. So tell us a bit about your initial beginnings as a poet.
Wow, it's hard to even think about that first poem, which takes me back to 13 or 14 years old. And writing, I think about a sister I essentially never had, because it was someone born before me who died in childbirth. So imagining that. So I was always interested in what might have been the imaginary, and I knew that was a poem when I was writing. I had read many poems. I wouldn't say my parents had a lot of poetry in the house, but they had things like the great books of the Western world. So I read Shakespeare and Tennyson and the Romantic poets and some of those people when I was very young, and really was moved by that work. It was not till significantly later that I realized there were such things as living poets, even though I was beginning to become one just by writing that first poem. And I think in a way, when one writes a poem, you send it out into the world and it becomes part of this community of poems that have existed since people started writing on stones, and right up to the present and beyond.
Now you talk about that intangible quality. Is that quality, is that essence something that's essential to a poem or a good poem, or what is, in your view, essential to either poetry or what you would say good poetry?
I think it's very hard to point to specifics there. I think that poetry is, as the poet Charles Olson said, a high energy construct that takes energy from wherever the poet got it and transfers it by way of the poem all the way over to the reader. Or someone else said poetry is news that stays news. Or I love what the poet William Carlos Williams said when he said, people say you cannot get the news from poetry, but men die every day for lack of what is found there. So I think there is something of essence, of spirit, of an imagination that if it's lost in our lives, we lose something extremely valuable. But to say it, it has to have, X number of images or rhythms or meters or rhymes or anything like that is getting too specific, because you can always find exceptions.
When Frost went around the world, Robert Frost, he hears in the words of ordinary folk, he hears the lines of his poems. And when Whitman walks the battlefield in the Civil War, he sees in the wounds of the dying soldiers, he sees the material for his poems, right? Where do you look for the materials for your poems?
I look, well, this sounds trite, but I look to love. I would that I were open to it, I think is a line from a Canadian poet. But that would mean anything one might love that is inspiring in that way. So yes, by moving through a landscape of sometimes cataclysmic problems, or walking the coastline of Wales in a little town called Aberystwyth, which I did a few years ago while I was trying to find out about a Welsh poet that was alive in the early part of the 20th century, or just the other day on the Oregon coast, but also right here in Tucson. It's sort of if you tune those ears, and I think poets do that. That is part of our life's work, to tune those ears and to make connections between what we see and hear and words that we use. And so, I was looking at this journal, which I was working on when I first moved to Tucson in 1984, and picked it up today. And there's a poem in there that comes from the little shrine at El Tiradito, which is a shrine to lost causes, if you will. So they come from everywhere. And I think if Whitman had not lived through the Civil War, he still would have found human necessity somewhere in his life, as he did in other places too, that would have moved him.
So Charles Alexander is the poet of lost causes.
I don't think anyone would ever say that. I wrote that one poem, and there are a lot of lost causes out there.
Yeah.
One of the poets I most respect right now is a man who was a Vietnamese refugee when he was young, who came here. His name is Linh Dinh, and he's keeping a photographic blog called State of the Union, where he's taking photographs of homeless camps, closed down shopping malls, all kinds of things like that. He's the poet of lost causes. I'll let him have that title.
Switching gears just a little bit, thinking practically. I've heard that some poets wake up and the first thing they do is they write 5 poems, and then they drink their coffee, and then they have to go do their day job, right? Is your writing process rigorous in that way, or are you a little bit more spontaneous? How is it that you do the nuts and bolts?
I am a poet who reads a lot, for one thing, and my reading moves me too. But I tend to write on a project basis. So that kind of schedule, where I might wake up first thing in the morning and write, I don't know about before coffee, but after the first cup of coffee, would be true at certain times when I've found something that I'm actually working on. But I'm not one who does that every day, and even when I don't have something in mind, write something in a journal. I mean, the journals have piled up over the years, but they have been not in quite that regular process. On the other hand, when I am carried away with something, sometimes I'm writing for hours a day rather than this couple of hours to fit it in, and keeping me up at nights, and hopefully doesn't keep me from going to teach classes and things like that. But it's all engrossing.
And how do you come upon a project, or do you read something in the news to go back a step that sort of provokes you, or is it more visceral than that?
Either way. Sometimes it's very visceral. Sometimes it's a news thing. Sometimes it is from a reading and a reaction to something someone else wrote. But I want to go back to a poet you mentioned, Robert Frost, who said in an essay that when a poet begins a poem, he or she should not know where they're going. So in essence, I can begin at any number of places, but it's the poem itself, once I start, that leads me somewhere. And sometimes it leads me into, extremely elongated works of many parts, like the Pushing Water poems, which is my next to last book, was titled Pushing Water, and it's over 200 pages of 52 numbered poems, which take some different shapes, but the whole has a shape of its own too, and that's that was a period, I think, in which I found many things about my own maturity as a poet and maybe as a human being.
Yeah, you mentioned Frost. I think the line was no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. And
I like surprise, so I would have a little argument with Frost at that time about that. He also defines a poem as a momentary stay against confusion, and to me, I think of a poem as a flow right through that confusion and with it, and I tend to more invoke John Keats, who had this concept which he called negative capability, which is he defined as the ability to exist amid doubts and confusions without always reaching toward logic and explanation. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing.
Right, and I think he relished that surprise too.
Yes.
But with Frost, he'll say yes and no at the same time.
Yes, and he can be surprising too, to be fair to him.
Yeah. And one of, I think, the struggles is for poetry in general, is for readers of poetry. And I guess to sort of combine two questions in once, can you tell us a little bit about your reading process? I mean, as a publisher, as a poet, as just an avid lover of poetry, how do you read a poem, right? What do you do when you first come to that poem?
I read right through it, and I probably read it slower than some people would, because I think for me, reading, I was so glad, I was trained at a time when we thought about phonics and phonetics, so I hear as I read, and so I hear those syllables, and actually, if that is interesting to me, if the way the poem moves as sound in space, then I'll read it again. Then I'm kind of hooked, and I'll keep coming back to it. It may be, quite a long time before I feel like I really get what that poet's doing, and it may be years that I get other things out of it too. But I compare that when I'm teaching, to some of my students when they find a song they like. I mean, they don't just listen to it once. They listen to it hundreds of times, and I think good poems invite that kind of attention.
Yeah, and that's a great point. To be comfortable with poetry is to be comfortable with uncertainty.
Yes,
right? And that's a hard thing to be comfortable with.
Yeah, I tell, I'm teaching a class right now in which I'm introducing some 18 and 19-year-olds to a little bit of poetry, and I tell them, don't worry so much about what it means. Worry about what it does, how it impacts you, what it sounds like, how it makes you feel, what kinds of things are in it, and let all those things add up later to maybe what you think it means. But don't feel like it's a puzzle you're supposed to solve, because it's not. The poet, I don't think any poet thinks, yes, I'm making puzzles for people to solve and I'm going to make them difficult for them.
Yeah. Dan Chasen once told me, there is no poetry decoder ring.
That's right.
So thinking about younger poets or newer poets, what advice do you have for younger or newer poets in Tucson who are, looking to get involved or maybe not sure how to get involved?
Yeah. Well, getting involved is, of course, a part of it. And one thing I hope young poets think is it's not all about your own work. You're entering into this field of poetry that involves a whole lot of things and a whole lot of people. And the more you care about the whole of that field, the more your opportunities are going to be for your work. So, in Tucson, there are groups out of Casa Libre and La Solana. There are It's the group POG in town that are presenting reading series. There are publication projects. I love the way the poetry world, interacts with kind of the zine world, or did several years ago. Now I think the zine world has mostly gone digital, but that's all right too. There's those kind of opportunities. So get involved, do things, meet people, and expand, your connections and opportunities. Don't feel like you have to do that thing where you're the lonely writer and the publishers are somewhere out there and I'm just going to send them my work even though I don't really know them, and hopefully they will say, yes, I want to publish you. That could be deadly. And I think a lot of the poetry world for publishing has gone, particularly for first books, to contests that people submit to. And I'm very much opposed to making literature competition. And I think that I've known people who have basically stopped writing because they tried to win a contest for 5-10 years and they didn't win one, so they didn't get some things published. And in those 10 years, they could have been part of a publishing collective. They could have helped to publish others' works, and that would have given them, I think, a richer life in the language.
And there's something in there that's unique to Chaz Press, isn't there?
I don't know about unique, but Chaz Press is definitely involved in that. It's how, I started Chaz Press out of having learned printing and design and bookmaking with others, and then started publishing some people I had met and knew. Some of them happened to be sort of renowned poets, but some of them even to this day, and we've published 150 books, and some of the last 3 to 6 books we've published were somebody's either first book or second book. I really believe in that. This event I mentioned in Portland, there's been 2 events like that in the past where a lot of people published by Chaz Press got together for readings and celebration. One in San Francisco, one in New York, over the last 15 years. This is the first one in which I looked out and realized, except for one person, every one of the poets I had published in this group was younger than me. And that's a really great place to come to, because I grew up, adoring my elders, and now I adore my youngers too.
One of the challenges facing the publishing industry as a whole is this sort of reinvention of the business model given ebooks and social media. And so this might be a loaded question, but I'm going to do it anyway.
It's okay.
Is social media, is digital media a blessing or a curse for the poet? And what about for the publisher too?
It's probably a blessing and a curse. For me, it's definitely a way of keeping contact with so many more people than you would be in contact with. It's a way of getting the word out as a publisher of what you're doing, and just reaching a broad public with it. Even though sometimes things are so quick. You put a note out on something like Facebook, and if people don't see it in the first 3 hours, they may never see it. I don't publish ebooks, and Chaz Press doesn't publish ebooks. It is something we've been considering for probably a year, but haven't just made that leap yet. But we do, actively use social networking to share what we do, and also to comment on what other people are doing. I think that's another thing about it. It equalizes the field. If you use it only to be like advertising, to broadcast what you're doing, I don't think that's what it's for. I think if you're using it to participate as one in a broad community, then it can be actually pretty great. Now, I do know poets, including ones I've published, that just don't do it at all, and they feel like it would be a time suck, and it can be that. I have to watch it a little bit. Yeah.
But like you say, there needs to be a give and a take. You can't just expect it to solve all your problems right away. You have to, again, it's a community. In as much as one needs to get out, of their house in Tucson, head on downtown, and go to Casa Libre and go to POG and shake hands. You do that in the digital world as well.
Absolutely, and that's been a change in the last maybe 10 years in the digital world. It used to be somebody put up a website, it was fairly static. You hope people come there. But now, You put up a website, you change it often, you bring people to it through Facebook and Twitter and all of that, and it's a whole active world.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that'd be something I'd say to young poets: be activists. And whether you're doing it on paper, whether you're doing it digitally, hopefully you're doing it partly on foot, meeting people in your own community, because your peers are, you're a real primary audience.
Mm-hmm. Good. I was hoping if I could trouble you to read for us now.
Sure.
I know that you brought some poems. I know you have your new book here, and I'm just going to leave it to you.
Okay. And I'm going to read the second of 3 pieces in this book. Some sentences look for some periods. I'm just going to start, and if I go too long, you cut me off. But something that mothers and does not know where to go in the night. Or is it morning now? Will you tell me it is morning now, so that I might think of the sunlight before the sun is visible, before its letters proclaim the day in heat and light, and one sharp motion that might blind or displace the insects from their sleeping places? If I might write just a moment of the day, I might begin with, "As you wish," or "Ripeness is all," whereas we all know the end is, "The rest is silence," as in the movie about Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, as in the words of Hamlet, as if words were in words and sunlight twisted around the letters until lost at the end of day in a graying haze. One upon the string, the G string, the C string, the sing string. "To mother, to foal," she said. And mother left a year ago. But mother of my children remains, and we hold each other in scheduled time on a Sunday morning, and in unscheduled time whenever we may please. Does it please you, if you please? Pleasure and a lover. And what else does one need? Don't forget to breathe on a Friday, for this is the day of release. Hold, 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 and then let go. One can't build a snowman here unless the climb leads to forests in February, if lucky in the open field between the ever-green branches. But snowmen are a part of my past, once with a red corduroy jacket that my father wore, too. Or perhaps this is a memory mixture, i.e. the way truth isn't what happened, but an invented memory of what happened. For is and isn't are not divergent, just different sides of a coin, whereas different coins might reveal entirely different vistas. From where I sit at this moment, shelves are going out from me, and there upon them, one by one, a blue book, an orange book, a black book, a purple book, a silver book, rows and rows of party-colored things made of paper and ink and thread. These are such dreams as stuff is made on. But in the corner, an orange coffee cup and a transportation, not a transmogrification, to a town among mountains with coffee and sunlight and words, words, words. No matter, no matter, no water, no wafer, no was, no is. Who am I to call the kettle black, to call you to me for a bright, wet kiss on the pillow? In the pillow one sinks and rises, falls and emerges, breathes and stops. A backstop stands behind the catcher. The catcher sits behind home plate. Home plate is buried in the dirt at the corner of the base path. The base path forms a triangle around the pitcher. The pitcher gets things going with a wind-up and a pitch to a batter. The batter may be anyone at any given time trying to understand what is given to her, trying to return what the world throws at her, trying to find a way to the fence, to an opening in a fence that might allow more than simply a rearrangement of the parts. Parts are assigned. Actor A will play character Q, amateur volunteer B will play character T. Truth will be evident from the emotional conduct of arms and heads, heads and deads. I am aweary, I would that I were dead. Deads and beads, those beads that were his eyes, pearl up in my heart of all wonders. I wonder in my bead of all hearts, wander in eyes that curl up and ball up and fall into the time before I was born. I have not come here with empty hands. The lines throughout them will tell you stories. of what I have come here with. I have not come here alone, for wherever I go, she and he and she and she and she and she come with me. It is not possible to imagine being alone. No, that game with bases and fences is a team sport, as is the making of snow people, the playing of strings, the rising of the sun in the morning for as long as that may last. To come through conflicts and inventions and waxy worlds and earthquake palaces and hopeful buildings and near acts and random acts and washing waters, pushing, slanting, certain and uncertain, and still to float, even to power that floating with strokes of arms and legs, with pulses of torsos, and unflinching willingness to play the game, even to finish the game, despite the rather growing sense that there is no finish. There are no cells that complete the pattern. There may not even be colors one can trust. Some sentences, for some periods, look, and for some periods find naught but ripeness. All the rest is breathing. Pli selon pli, the music and the dance, the composer and the choreographer, the chromosome and the coloration, the painter and the poet, the step, step, step and turn, bowls and bowls, holes and holes, mothers and others loose in the night, in the light.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm struck, I hear two lines that sort of resonate. One was more at the beginning, the other one was at the end, and I think it sort of brings together the thesis of our talk. You say words within words, and then you say, I did not come here alone, right? And if you think of what you said about sound, C string, G string, C strings, right? And again, those sounds repeat throughout the poem. And I did not come here alone. For the words, you know, there is this entire signification process that happens. And in such a way, this poem is connected to all poems that have ever been written and that will ever be written, right? And so seeing this, and so unraveling the significations behind the individual words and the lines, you see how important it is for the poet to not come alone.
To not come alone and not move alone. And you know, even if you have to write these things alone, you're always conscious. And it's a language. I mean, I didn't invent this language. I don't own this language. That alone connects me to so many things. You know, one of my favorite poets called it a grand collage. And in a way, you know, that whole world of language and writing is a grand collage, but sometimes every single poem within it is also that.
Yeah. I'm afraid we're almost out of time, Charles, but thank you so much for joining us and sharing your work with us, and I look forward to seeing you downtown.
Thank you.